So welcome everyone to this Cybersecurity Magazine editorial podcast. I'm Philippa Jeffries and I'm here with Hans Christian Rudolph, also from CSM, and Rasmus Løvenstein Olsen from Aalborg University. And today we're discussing smart grids and security. And I guess to kick off, Rasmus, would you like to start explaining a bit about what is exactly considered a smart grid?
Yes, thank you, Philippa. So smart grid is not a single unique term that is being used. It's actually, if you go to different parts of the world, you get different opinions on what is smart grid. So my starting point would be what we are working with here in Denmark and Europe, which are fairly similar. So smart grid is actually a way to make the power grid as we know it today, which is fairly stupid. It's just an infrastructure to push energy to customers, that's us, and make that more intelligent in the sense that you want some more responsiveness from the grid in order to cope with certain events that happens in the grid. And that should be done because we want to cope with new ways of producing energies that are more in line with the green transition that we are seeing. So to a large extent, smart grid and green energy are terms that are tightly coupled. So that's how I perceive smart grids. The intelligence is quite important, and information, use of information.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess you already said it means different things to different people around the world. Maybe as far as Europe is concerned, how far along is the industry or that area already in implementing that in practice?
I think in Europe we are quite far ahead because a lot of the industry partners that I have a contact surface with is really trying to push their technology to support some fairly complex services that you would find in what we see as a smart grid. So that would be grid monitoring, grid event detection, voltage control for supporting more renewable energy resources down to the distribution grids, which you won't find in a standard grid today. There you just hope and cross your fingers that you have enough capacity to support these technologies that we want to connect to green energy. So I think we are quite far ahead, absolutely.
Okay, but clearly not all the way there yet, and I imagine a lot of the research that you're doing focus on some of the not downsides but challenges that the industry faces as it's moving into that direction. What are some of the main privacy security issues that you observe or that you see?
One of the first things that we encountered was really, and actually that has been ongoing for a long time, is that measurements from household levels reveal something about the user's consumptions, or daily behavior, monthly behavior, hourly behavior, so different time scale. And now with increasing smartness, you may want to go down to smaller scale, so 10 minutes, 5 minutes interval, which really starts to see come down to a level where you can start to see what are you doing these 5 minutes, what are you doing right now. I'm not saying that you can check on those information, what is your TV on, what are you watching, but you can tell something about, are you home, are you active, are you not active. And there's some really deep privacy issue here that you need to be concerned about, and that's something that the industry is taking quite seriously. There's really some strict regulatory framework. We also know from GDPR that are bound to use of this information. And I think that those are really the main concerns at the moment. because other things like the voltage in the grid are not so privacy concerns, but that's more like the common area, so you can't pinpoint that back to individual persons. It's more to the how is the current grid doing. Power flows in the higher levels are also not so personal, so it really boils down to what can you measure at individual households. And the more fine-grained you become, the more detailed you become, the more you can tell about individuals. There are technologies, for example, that also these smart home, smart buildings, where you can control individual elements in your household, which used in the wrong way, you can actually predict also what you will do next. And that could be beneficial, for example, for a thief to know that you are not home in a couple of hours because you're doing this and that. It could be beneficial for also insurance companies, because you can use that as evidence that you behaved in a certain way. So there are definitely some issues.
Okay, and just to be clear, your research focuses on the privacy aspects. Does that also include, besides the privacy, also security issues, like how, you know, measuring equipment at the end user side could be abused, things like that? Because I have a feeling that when people think about, you know, security issues in the smart grid, they are not immediately thinking of, okay, how could the data that's being collected be abused, but how could the equipment itself be turned, you know, into a malicious device?
Yes, we are doing several things in my research, and we did do a lot of study of this privacy, because at the end of the day, many of these smart grid services don't strictly need to know exactly what you're doing. That's not the point here, but extracting features and trends may be relevant, and then there you might be able to hide something. So this is something we work on. To what level do we actually need information? That's also in line with the current GDPR, that you need a purpose in order to use data, and that's quite a driving factor for our research. To what level do we actually need information? Because that's typically end up as trade-off between what can algorithms perform versus what quality do you get, and that boils down to what do we need for the smart grid services to operate properly. So that's one aspect, but we certainly also looked into other types of security aspects. We had a project at some point where we tried to penetration test these smart meters that we have in Denmark. We did that in collaboration with a Danish company that provided the smart meters, and we let some students try to see what can we actually do. And it did find a few things, nothing seriously, but the point is that these smart meters are now being equipped with more and more advanced functionality. And one of them is, if you don't pay the electricity bill, you should remotely be able to shut down electricity supply for household. That's nice for those who want the payment of your electricity consumption, and you need to do that, obviously. But in the wrong hands, of course, this can turn into a rather nasty weapon. Consider ransomware, where you are not threatened by your data, but simply on your electricity bill. And if you don't pay up, I will shut down your electricity supply. That would be a bit nasty, I would say, in particular if an attack of that is on a larger scale. So at the end of the day, this comes down to how you handle the keys to get access to the smart meters, and how you secure the whole infrastructure. And that is something that we also trying to work with together with the Danish meter company. So but and that would obviously also affect some of the other services. I mean, you could have an attack where I shut off cities switching on again, so not directly on the end user, but the grid infrastructure itself, because switching on and off whole areas at the time, that is really something that could break down infrastructure at the end of the day.
Are there any examples of where an attack like this has happened?
I was reading about a case in, I think it was in southern Great Britain, where where this area had this type of meter where they had a unique key for all meters that was stolen.
Okay.
Now you had this master key for the whole area, which posed, of course, a threat. I think they solved it somehow, but that made me think, if you actually can do that, then you can do some really nasty type of attacks. At least it didn't go beyond that. They lost the key and then everything was solved. And then the classical situation with the Ukrainian power system that was hacked and taken down for quite some time is another example. And here you really see what is actually the impact of not having power. That's really one of the fundamental elements and resources in our daily lives. So it's quite important that we keep protecting what we have. And
you mentioned earlier that actually national regulators are already on the topic, that there's already a awareness that this has significant impact potentially. And I would imagine such companies don't start from zero just because the grid is becoming smart now. So how do you perceive the general state or maturity of the industry in terms of handling security, ensuring the equipment that they operate is hardened to a certain extent?
I think there has been an increased level of maturity for the last decade. When I started in this field, no doubt that the security was not really in place, but now I see again this Danish company, their security and protection of the meter infrastructure has dramatically increased, and they do quite a thing. And from what we learned when we had these students to analyze the system was that they're really taking a lot of the steps by dividing things into sectors, dividing roles and keys. The way they manage the keys are quite nicely done, and they have the benefit that since they're producing things locally here in Denmark, then they also have the ability to not pushing keys outside of their own factory. So there's a whole infrastructure built around protecting these meters, which I think makes good sense. But on the other hand, you then have what you say, the end customer, in this sense that the distribution system operators, the DSOs, are just ramping up now. So they're starting to realize, okay, maybe security is something we need to take a bit more serious. And then you have all the aggregators that just recently came into place, which may or may not have a nice maturity level, because many of them are just starting up, and you see a lot of new startup companies, in particular here in Denmark, which works with smart grid concepts, smart charging companies, and so on. Yeah. Where you can have your doubt if they're really all the way with security. And the complexity of all these actors, I think, is a huge challenge when it comes to securing the infrastructure, because if one of these elements are not secure, then what does that mean to the rest of the chain? I mean, you could have a breach, someone who just started up, that could potentially lead to the rest. So in Denmark, at least, we have this organization where the industry meets and take these different topics up for some internal discussion, and there's an attempt to learn from each other, but it's not, for some reason, this security is something where people are still, I want to keep it for myself, I don't want to share my experience. And I think this is one of the huge barriers at the moment for the industry, that we don't dare to share enough of the experiences that are happening in order to make faster progress towards a more secure infrastructure.
Yeah, I guess the concerns there are similar to what we see in other industries as well, like the fear of giving away too much, exposing yourself to threat because you publish such information, and obviously the reputational damage that is arguable. I think as you said, learning from mistakes is always better than trying to hide them.
Exactly. But at least there's an attempt to bring up these topics. We are participating frequently in these meetings where someone comes and talks about this and that. But the experiences is still a very sensitive topic, I would say.
Yeah.
Okay. Now you already mentioned some of the security privacy challenges that you're looking into in your research. Can you walk us through maybe one particular area, one particular use case that you're looking into in your research?
Yes, we had a project. Now it's done, but we had a nice project where we were focused on control of at the medium voltage part of wind turbines and solar panels at a larger scale, where we were trying to see. So you have this feedback loop, such that you can control output voltage and frequency to meet the demand in the grid, which works nicely. We designed this control loop nicely. And then we wanted to see, what if someone intercepted that control loop and were able to do different types of attacks, say a replay attack of packets, or a denial of service attack to this control loop. And what we would see, of course, was not good. But what was interesting is that there was a certain degree of robustness built in the control loop. So some of the types of attacks, like the replay attacks, was not so damaging as the DOS attack, which really ended up being in leading to some severe deviation from the needed, which eventually led to voltage rise and voltage oscillations. So that would be one case. Then we had another case where we were trying to look into a bit the same thing, but on the low voltage side, where we wanted to see if we have a smart grid service that operates PV units to secure voltage in the low voltage grid, then what would happen if we again intercepted the package? And you would see different scale of impact, but similar trend, that there would be you could actually eventually, by intercepting the loop, performing, for example, replay attacks or DOS attacks on this loop, then you could actually do some damage to the whole grid infrastructure. The scale of it again was different. So I think the lesson that we took from that is that depending on the smart grid service you are working with, and depending on the attack, you might want to focus on some types of attack rather than others, because security at the end of the day, of course, is a matter of also financing. I mean, it has a cost associated to protect things. So you want to differentiate a little bit because some attacks are definitely more dangerous than others. And that was a bit our lessons from these two cases.
And in these cases, what kind of solutions could you see for that to protect the loops better?
What we definitely propose is that you would, at least for the type of replay attack, you would try to use more or less the standard way of doing things. But of course, you need the software that is executing these countermeasures correctly. So you need some standards to follow and some quality software and protocol stacks to follow that. The DOS attacks are similar to any other DOS attacks. There are some challenges to do that properly and some investments in order to mitigate the attacks. But maybe some of the more specific solutions are more interesting because I think utilizing the fact that these things are distributed in nature, maybe breaking these control loops up into smaller loops and making a bit more localized would mitigate some of the impact of attacks, because it's not only attacks, there could also be faults, of course. So instead of running huge areas under the same control loop, why not try to make use that you can separate them a bit more physical, so at least you can isolate things better if something does happen. Because I think security at the end of the day is also a matter of thinking at some point it will happen. At some point there will be some bad stuff going on, and then what? And I think that's the kind of direction I think we need to consider when and try to make use of the basic nature of the power grid, not just relying on default solutions for IoT and other internet-based solutions.
Essentially applying security best practices to the grid as well.
Exactly.
Segmentation, segregation. You mentioned proper key management earlier. All the things that you want to make sure you get right when designing such a system.
Exactly. But here the challenge, I think, also now our Danish company is one good case that does this very excellent. But the fact that there are so many actors on the field makes it much more hard, because who has to get a key to what? I think there's some challenge on an organizational level on handling keys between all the different actors. You have ESO, you have aggregators, you have vendors, you have retailers, you have I don't know what. There are so many different actors in the field, and who has to have the key for what purpose, in what duration, and so on. There's a huge challenge in handling keys at a higher level, I think, which is unresolved.
And even not even looking at the level of cryptographic keys, but you mentioned standardization earlier. So to what extent is the whole system itself standardized and agreed upon across organizations?
I mean, there are definitely good standards, i.e. C61850 is one of the current, state-of-the-art standard, but it is huge and it is complex, and it contains so many substandards that it's a bit of a nightmare to go into it. But it does cover a lot of things, also security related to smart grids, and it tries actually to compose the different levels of the grid. Maybe the low voltage grid is a little bit still out of the reach for that standard, but then there are other standards. But I think coming to the new services of smart grid and the new actors that needs to be defined as there's still some work ahead to define standards on how to interact. And I think this is another big challenge, because in Denmark we have one way of doing it, and in Germany there's another situation, in France a third situation, and even within Europe there's so many ways that the lower part of the grid is interacting. It's a huge mess at the moment, I would say, and that needs to be cleared up before I think we can work. Or maybe it's even a bit of a chicken and the egg problem, because having standards could also help pushing this in some direction to clean up things. But standards are not just popping up. There's some industrial support, of course, needed. So it's a little bit of a chicken egg problem here, I think.
Yeah, we talk quite a lot about Europe. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the rest of the world when it comes to security for smart grids.
I think there's, I think honestly, there's very different take on smart grid and security everywhere. I mean, I think everybody agrees security is important, and particularly, I guess, in Ukraine after that incident, I think we probably prioritized it a bit more. I hope so. I think also after the case in Texas, now that was not an attack as such, but I mean, there are places where you see, okay, we actually need to do something. And at the end of the day, I think we all face the same problem, that we need somehow to protect this in a smart way. Now, the challenge is, as I said, we do things differently. In US, they have a very different way of doing it than here in Europe. And I'm not sure about Russia and China, but so somehow we need to find the common denominator in this work. And there are some, definitely, because at the end of the day, we all want power out of our outlets, and that power comes from somewhere. So it's the basic problem. Just how we do it is slightly different. And I think the way that we manage to do and secure to some extent the whole communication in the internet level in this world, I think we could learn from that in some way. There's some lessons to be learned. Now, the tricky part about the energy sector is that it's a bit of a conservative sector. So what they did last year is also the trend they want to do this year, because it worked back then. And I think that relates to the fact that many of the components, once they're pushed in the field, they have to sit around for 15 to 30 years. And if you look at the communication sector, that's ancient technology at this stage. So the time span at which you invest in the grid at a physical component level is way different from what we're used to from the IT world, where you just push an update, and you do that some weeks, months after you discover the security breach. But in this world, if something is fundamentally flawed in a physical device, you probably just have to gonna live with it for the next 15 years, unless it's really, really at a scale that you could lose a whole city or something like that. So there's also some mentality that really needs to change, I think. But it boils down to also business models, how you invest in the grid. And I think at the end of the day, it boils then back to politician support, how the politics supports this.
Okay, with these sort of timelines, I guess there's a whole host of security considerations that, just because of the long lifespan of these systems, is to be considered. And obviously this is there with non-smart technology as well. But you know, as we progress now and look 20, 30 years ahead, I would imagine things like quantum safe cryptography are at least, you know, in the back of the heads of some people. in communication, we're already talking about that for a number of years. What are some of the other challenges that you are aware of that stem out of this, just long lifespan of these systems?
Yeah, because I fully agree. And in 30 years from now, on the IT side, quantum cryptography and all that is, I would expect that to be some way standard. But at that time, you would still live with smart meters that are deployed as of today's technology, and maybe you even have older stuff. So I think the challenge is to see how we can somehow make use of what we deploy today in a environment where you expect quantum level cryptography to be a standard, and I think that has to be considered at product development phase. And I know some companies are doing that already now. For example, this with isolating device communication to their own radio or frequency domain, or you really do some physical steps that you try to isolate systems as much as possible. And this is also why you see the industry in this field being quite conservative. You don't want to just take any solution because of this fact. And yeah, so I think that really is one of the key challenges. Then you can talk about all the businesses you build on top, all these actors, aggregators. They typically would rely on more modernized communication infrastructure, and I think those would be better suited because you can easily adapt updates to operating systems, to computer technology, to communication technologies as the rest of the world. But the grid component vendors, I think they have a challenge that they need to address.
Actually, good point that you talk about the grid component vendors. There's a ongoing discussion which is politically quite hot on supply chain security in communications, in the technology field in general. What does the supplier landscape for smart grid look like? Is that centralized or sort of focused on a specific geography? Is that developed all over the world?
I think a little bit of both. I think it's I mean, each company try their best, of course, because this is also a competitor thing, of course. But at the end of the day, we all want a proper stable grid. So I know there's also work on the security standards within the field. We have some collaboration with an Italian research institute which pushes research result into some of these standards in the field, which tries to basically focus the industry around certain aspects on how they should protect and create some proper guidelines on how to test and validate the equipment. But at the same time, you also see different vendors, and they try to again take this. I do my stuff, and I think I do the best thing, and I won't tell you because it's a competition at the end of the day also. So I think there's a little bit of both sides as today, which I I'm not sure it is purely beneficial. I mean, we all want good security standards because we all want to live in a world where I can freely choose my meter infrastructure without worrying about whether this is a secure one or not. That would be the ideal, I think. But I think we have a long way to go.
Okay. Any final questions, Hans? Any comments?
Well, I guess that naturally leads us to to an outlook of what you think would be required going forward. Maybe some of the areas that are particularly in need of enhancements.
I think first most there still need to be a much better consensus around what are smart grids and what actors do we have, because I think one of the key problem is that it's still very unclear what roles are defined for different actors in the expected smart grid scenarios, and that ties to the fact that, as I said in the beginning, some places smart grids are perceived differently from other places. So how do you define an aggregator in Denmark may not be the exact same way as you do in Europe and rest of the Europe or in US, which makes it a bit harder to make products that just fits into a global landscape of grid, smart grids. So I think there needs first to be a consensus. This is what we are doing, and you see the same thing also from the communication side, defining what is 4G, what is 5G, what is 6G, and so on. It takes a while before the industry agrees this is what we are going for. I would like to see something like that also happening in this field, and I don't see it happening right now. It's just, we do this in Denmark, we do this in Germany, we do this in Russia, and we call that smart. And then you end up doing a little bit of this and that all over the world. So I think that's because once we get a fully agreement, then I think we would also start to see, but then we can work towards worldwide standards, which would guide products to follow certain level of quality and expected results in the same way as you see in the communication infrastructure world. And I think that's really what I would hope to see coming up. And I know there's different ways to approach this, but it's a bit of a hilltop, I think, still.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Rasmus. It's been really interesting. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you also for giving me this opportunity, and thanks for some really good and tough questions. I think it's but it's an interesting development
definitely.
Seeing. So I hope that we make progress, but no doubt that security is definitely something people are watching, because we've seen too many cases where it failed not only in smart grid but everywhere else, and people don't want to end there. Yes.
Absolutely. Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Rasmus.